They laughed when they read my name and told me I'd gotten nothing but a barn. Thunder rolled over the valley like an accusation as Lila Hartwell sat unmoving in the second row, knots of grief and fury working under her ribs. The polished coffin at the front caught the funeral lights and made her father a glassy silhouette while whispers folded and refolded through the room like bad weather. The lawyer's voice trembled through the sentence that felt more like a verdict than a memory. The grand house, the vineyards, the cars, everything went to the sons from his first marriage, their mother smiling with a blade of triumph in her perfectly set teeth. And then, with a brief, strange hesitation that tasted like a dare, the lawyer cleared his throat and read the 2 lines that named Lila the old farmhouse and the adjacent barn. Laughter cracked the room open like thin ice. One brother said she could have the hay. Another joked about finding a horse to match. Lila's hands were so tight her knuckles shone white. She rose without argument, folding the deed into her coat like a fragile promise. And when the rain met her windshield on the drive back to the valley, it sounded to her like a clean, small benediction. The barn waited at the edge of the property, its roof sagging, shutters dangling, ivy like slow, green stitches clinging to weathered wood. And when she pushed the heavy door open, the scent of hay and oil and old conversations folded over her like an old coat. Dust spun in shafts of gray morning light, cobwebs hung like forgotten lace, and the barn beneath her feet creaked with memory. She found a cracked broom, started sweeping, and in the slow, mechanical rhythm of work something unclenched inside her. Hours passed in the light made golden by the sun that finally burned through the rain. Blisters rose on her palms and she laughed, low and private, because for the first time since the funeral grief changed shape into resolve. She found the carved initials on a warped beam. H+LH, the small L her younger hand had once scored into wood, and beneath it the split in the timber suggested something had been pried loose long ago. She pressed where the grain gave and a floorboard lifted, revealing a small compartment that held a brass key wrapped in oilcloth and a folded note in her father's slanted hand that read, "Where the earth meets its mirror, truth waits for its keeper." The key felt heavy and promising in her palm. That night she listened to the valley breathe under moonlight and could not sleep until she had pulled on her father's old jacket and followed the flashlight beam across damp grass back into the barn, where she discovered a hairline crack in the concrete under a stack of crates. The panel lifted like a secret exhaling and narrow steps disappeared into a small, packed earth chamber lined with wooden shelves. Lila's light found boxes labeled in her father's careful script, harvest logs, company records, and then a box with her name scrawled on the lid. Inside were folders bound with twine, photographs, notarized seals, incorporation papers that named her as the principal shareholder of Hartwell Holdings, and a dusty cassette player that, when she pressed play, filled the small room with her father's voice telling her that he had set the company up in her name years ago, hidden it where only she might find it, and kept it safe from people who would confuse titles for ownership. He said simply and precisely, "Trust the barn. It will keep what mattered." The tape clicked off and the chamber hummed with the weight of years of planning and love. What had read like humiliation at the reading of the will suddenly had context. Her father had not disinherited her. He had outwitted the greed that circled the family like a slow storm. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Loom. Your support helps us spread more light in a world that desperately needs it. Armed with the documents, a bruised quiet inside her that had hardened into steadiness, Lila walked into the downtown conference room where her stepmother sat like a monarch behind the polished oak, flanked by attorneys and the 2 brothers whose smirks wilted when Lila laid down the sealed certificates and incorporation papers. The air-conditioned hush seemed suddenly intrusive. She watched the color drain from the woman who had called her earthy with a smile that could have cut glass. The lead lawyer said the papers would have to be verified. Minutes later, a clerk from the registrar's office returned with certified printouts confirming Lila as the majority shareholder of Hartwell Holdings, and with that, legal control of the farms, the houses, the cars, and the assets the family had assumed they controlled by virtue of titles alone. Shock moved through the room like a slow tide, denials, sputtered accusations of forgery that crumpled against the notary stamps and the recording of her father's voice, until the stepmother rose, face ashen, and something like a fracture ran through the polished facade. Lila did not gloat. She did not rub salt into old wounds. She simply stated, calmly and with an almost gentle finality, that she wasn't there to take homes, only to honor the truth her father had left her to protect. The stepmother filed an appeal, predictably and loudly, but the evidence was meticulous and the truth, like a good seed, was stubborn. Weeks later, the court confirmed what the papers had already whispered in the barn's dusty light. The weeks after the verdict were small and steady miracles. Reporters came and went, the valley buzzed with new life, and Lila spent mornings climbing ladders and repainting eaves and afternoons poring over ledgers that showed, in careful numbers, a life of quiet. Stewardship her father had built. The barn that had been laughter's punchline became the vault of his fidelity. She restored its loft, coaxed light into corners that had only known shadow, and felt, with each nail and brushstroke, a wound stitch closed. One afternoon the two brothers returned, not with the polished arrogance of men who had never known to kneel, but with soft faces and a small wrapped box. Inside lay their father's tarnished pocket watch, polished and warm. They said little, no contrite speeches, no clamoring apologies, but their hands trembled as they handed the watch to Lila, and the gesture held more than words could have managed. A quiet acknowledgement that the man who had loved them all had been clever in the only way that mattered, by protecting the kind of future his daughter could steward with care. Lila stood on the barn steps as the sun lowered the valley into a wash of gold, the watch ticking faint and sure in her palm, and for the first time since the funeral the ache felt like a place where something tender could grow. She thought of the tape, of the note, of the brass key that had opened not just a lock but the truth her father had trusted her with, and she realized the inheritance was never about property alone but about the courage to protect what little goodness remained when greed came calling. The farm smelled of wet soil and new paint. Birds nested in the rafters and laughter, soft, not mocking, found its way back into the loft. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and comment, and tell us where you're watching from so we can appreciate you. Lila closed the barn door that evening with hands that had both cleaned and kept a promise, feeling her father near in the creak of the hinges and the warmth of the wood under her palm, understanding finally that justice often arrived in whispers and careful plans rather than the thunder of revenge. She held the pocket watch to her ear, felt its steady beat, and looked out over the fields where rain would one day come again to soften the earth. She smiled, small and certain, because love had been the cleverest thing of all and the barn had been its guardian. Because kindness always wins.